You've heard about short-term rentals because everybody seems to be talking about them. But have you heard of midterm rentals? In today's episode, we get to learn from Erin Spradlin, who is a midterm rental expert. Let's jump in so you can learn if this investing strategy is for you.
Are you a working professional but struggling to balance the workload of your career, family, obligations, and preparing for your financial future? If so, this podcast is for you. You've spent years learning your craft, and now it's time to focus on your financial future. This podcast will teach you what you need to retire wealthy and happy. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Retire Wealthy and Happy podcast. We created this podcast to provide financial tips and tricks to help people build up their passive income. Also, we provide methods you can use to protect your wealth so you can plan a better future for yourself and your family. We're grateful to have this podcast sponsored by Monument Real Estate Capital. Monument Real Estate Capital is helping you retire 10 years early through real estate investments.
On today's episode, we're excited to have Erin Spradlin with us. A brief background about Erin. She is the co-owner of Erin and James Real Estate based in Denver, Colorado. She is a founder of Denver Women Invest. She is the host of the Colorado Real Estate Podcast. She is the author of 2 books. She is a spreadsheet nerd and is great at communicating quickly with those she does business with. A brief overview of what will be covered in today's episode. We're going to talk about short-term and midterm rentals. We're going to talk about house hacking, and we're going to talk about Erin's take on the Colorado real estate market.
Erin, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Would you be willing to share with us some of your story about how you got started in real estate?
Yeah, definitely. So I never saw myself in real estate, but I did see myself as a small business owner. And I liked, I was always interested in an independent future without a boss. And in 2014, I was dating my boyfriend, now husband, and we weren't ready to make that commitment yet, but we both had properties. So I just put my property up on Airbnb just to see if I could make some money. And it's so weird because 2014 isn't that long ago, but in Airbnb years, it's a really long time ago. You didn't have to be fancy. It wasn't very competitive. Within putting my place up, I had a $100 rental within 30 minutes. And so that started it for us. So we just started to amass different rentals. We moved in together because we wanted to rent out one of the places. And then we both saw an opportunity when Denver changed their laws to prohibit short-term rentals. We saw an opportunity in the real estate space where we thought investors would probably want to know where it's legal, what cities it's legal. So we both quit our jobs within a month of each other, went into real estate, and our expertise became short-term rentals and working with investors and just talking about what they like, what they don't like, and then specializing the deals around them. So it's been great. It's been a wild ride, but I'm so happy we did it.
Is it impolite to ask how many units you've got now?
Yeah, over the years, we've had 8 total. Right now we have 4, and we are purchasing a place in Mexico right now to do short-term rentals. Our other investments are in Colorado, but this will be our first time out of state and first time out of country.
What part of Mexico?
Puerto Vallarta.
Awesome. When you get that ready, let's do some investigation in another podcast.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people that are curious about investing in Mexico, and I think that they are definitely seeing more and more Americans come down.
We're currently looking at multiple developments that would be short-term rentals in Belize and Costa Rica, and Honduras. So we'll see how that goes. Why don't you tell us about how the Denver Women Investment Club got started?
Yeah. So when I was early days in real estate and knowing that this was going to be our niche, I remember the first investment meeting I went to. I think it was a Bigger Pockets meeting, but again, it was a long time ago. So it wasn't what Bigger Pockets is now, but it was still the investing club in Denver. And so we walked in, and it was in a brewery. There were probably 100 people there, and I was one of 3 women. Nobody could hear anything because the acoustics were terrible. And then it was just an intimidating environment. Like, the people that I try, you're trying to have conversations, but you can't hear anything. You don't know exactly what you're talking about. You don't want to expose yourself. And so I came with my husband, but had I not, I think I would have walked in and just turned around and walked out. And I felt like I can't be the outlier on that. And also, when I got my master's, my final paper was all about how women learn differently and how they're advertised and make decisions differently than men. So I felt like there was a real space to start an investing club that actually addresses how women might like to learn or network differently than how men do. And I felt like it was in a quieter space and more with professionals that are going to come and speak and then open a conversation around that. So that's kind of what it looks like. It's a free investing club. It's online now, so it's open to anyone, regardless of location. And we always have a professional come in, go through a deck, talk about their experience. And that professional can be in the real estate field or they can be an investor as long as they're female. That's the criteria. And then they come in and talk through it, and then we open it up for discussion. And I've been really happy with it. I think sometimes people don't like to talk about women as a subcategory of investors because it's like, I'm just an investor. I'm not a female investor. And I totally get that. I feel the same way. But I also think the reality is men and women come to decisions differently and they research a little bit differently. So I wanted to make a space for that.
That's very cool. We have I'm a board member on the Utah Real Estate Investors Association. And so my job there is the luncheon coordination, picking the speaker. I often try to do a 50-50 mix of men versus women for my speakers. And it's very hard to find women that are willing to speak and do it. We also have the subcategory that is women only. And so they get together at a different time, different place. And I'm also an admin on their Facebook page, but I don't ever talk. I just kick people out that don't belong.
Men. I get a lot of men trying to get into my group, and I'm like, no, this is a women only club. But yeah, that's interesting. It doesn't surprise me that it's hard to find female speakers for that environment.
Yeah.
Well, will you ask that next question?
Oh, yeah, sure. You recently started focusing on real estate consulting. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So I wrote a book in American Nomads came out. American Nomads is a book about midterm rentals. And that got published in July of 2021. And I've subsequently written a couple of other books. But as part of that, I have been doing a lot of YouTube videos to promote that book. With those YouTube videos, some people were asking me about consulting. And I have also noticed, just being a real estate agent, that a big fear for people is they want a second opinion. All the data and all the numbers can be there for you, but because it's such an expensive and the purchase has such gravity that people sometimes get analysis paralysis and can't make the next leap. So I thought that there was a real opportunity to be a second opinion with really no skin in the game. So if I'm your real estate consultant and not your agent, you can fully trust what I'm telling you because you're just paying me for my time for that hour. And then just talking to people, I do a lot of different stuff. Sometimes it's as basic as trying to figure out the platforms. Other times it's figuring out if a midterm or short term or long term is the better investment for you. A lot of people need help with pricing and listing. So all of that. But I really like it because those clients tend to have really specific questions. They're very happy with the help. They just tend to be a real pleasure. And you feel like you're bringing a lot of value to those calls.
So you're a realtor as well?
I am. I'm a full-time real estate agent. And then I would say I'm probably half and half with the consulting right now.
Do you find that there's a conflict of interest if you're not representing them as a realtor, but giving them real estate advice? Like that would be very close to the code of ethics problems here locally.
Yeah, I don't consult with people in Colorado. I consult with people usually out of state. And I'm not telling them like how to run their deal. It's more like, this is a midterm. These are the numbers. A long term is this number. A lot of the time I'll have people too that come in and they've had like a good example of this is someone will have run a long-term long-term rental for a long time, but they're hearing about medium terms all the time. So they want to get into it. And it's like, well, let's talk about that because does that actually make sense for you investing wise? So I would think the conflict would come if I'm talking to them about the contracts. but it's not necessarily that. It's more like, let's talk through what your mindset is and what the next best steps are.
Do you teach them how to get passive with their wealth and happiness?
I mean, I try to. There's a lot of fear, right? A lot of people feel like they need, and this is a different conversation, but property management. And I guess that would be a way of being passive. To me, I feel like that's not as necessary anymore with all of the tools available online and stuff. So that's a different conversation. But I think passive is certainly important. And I think I always describe myself as a lazy investor. And I guess that's kind of passive, but it's why I definitely prefer the midterm space to the short-term space. Is I find short-term clients require a lot more work, and they also tend to be much higher maintenance. And the midterm, they act very similarly to a long-term tenant once they've booked. So it's a lot less work, and I enjoy that a lot.
All right, so we're going to switch topics, Erin. Let's talk about short-term and midterm rentals. So before we really jump into it, would you be willing to just take a second and explain to the listeners what a short-term rental is and what a midterm rental is?
Yes, very good question. Okay, so short-term rental is going to be a furnished rental that is fewer than 30 days. And a midterm rental is going to be a furnished rental that's for more than 30 days. So people in the midterm space, the average rental length is 3 months, but a lot of times you'll see it between 2 months and 6 months. Sometimes people will renew their lease and they stay longer. It is important that you pay attention to the 30-day threshold. And the reason why I'm calling this out is because Airbnb talks about it as a 28-day threshold. But if you are trying to be in compliance with your local laws, so let's say your city has passed some legislation that prohibits short-term rentals, it's usually a 30-day threshold and not a 28-day threshold. So it's important to talk about that. But midterm, 30-day plus furnished, short-term, shorter than 30 days furnished.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, you're also the author of at least 2 books. I've got the titles as Guide to Midterm Rentals and American Nomads, Finding and Renting to Remote Workers. Do you have other books as well?
I have a book that will probably be out once this goes live. I don't know when it's going live, but it's called My First Rental Workbook. And it's all about how to set up. It's a workbook. So you're putting in information and stuff and getting to the end to figure out what your numbers are.
Okay, awesome. So look for that. Should we talk about why you chose to write the first 2 books?
Yeah, great question. I really like writing for one, but also in the real estate space, I sometimes get frustrated. I feel like it's pretty male dominated and maybe an older generation too, which is fine. I'm not one of those people that's like, that's all terrible. But I think that there is a new generation coming up and new people that want access to this. And sometimes I don't find, even with my clients and then my experience on calls and stuff, that real estate is very accessible to people. And sometimes too, they feel intimidated because they don't see people in that space that look like them. So I wanted to write material that I felt like was more hands-on and accessible to the end user, but also the reason why I finally got prompted to write the book is that in October of 2020, I was sitting in my car and NPR had an article or a news story about how 20 million people were thinking about moving or in the process of moving because of COVID. So remote work had led to not being geographically tethered to a single location anymore because of your job, and you could move around. And I had been thinking all during COVID, I thought, this is going to push the point of remote work. All these bosses that don't want to let their employees work remotely, it's going to force it. And so we kind of saw that. And then I heard this news story and I thought, boom, it's happening. And so I think this is going to be a huge trend. And I think it's going to midterm rentals, that 30 plus day furnished space. I thought it's going to graduate out of traveling nurses, which is how we normally think about it. Remote workers are really going to dominate this because young people that don't have kids and are a little bit established in their career, so they have some money, they're going to want to travel. And so people should be interested in this space. And added to that too, we had moved into the midterm rental space ourselves because we had these investments in Denver, and then Denver changed the law in 2017. So we had already made the shift to midterm rentals.
Well, that's awesome. You got a lot of experience, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show today. You may have already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on how remote work brings opportunities to the investment world?
Yes. So I think people should be paying attention to remote workers. Zillow's calling it the great reshuffling. And I think the reason for that is because these people that have money are no longer tethered to a single location. And I think when you look at younger generations too, they're not as interested in acquiring stuff and things. They're much more interested in experiences. And so if you're an investor and you're thinking about your end user or your client, your tenants, you need to pay attention to what they care about and what's important to them. And so remote work frees them up to travel. They don't care about owning stuff. So if you have furnished rentals, it's a really good opportunity because your tenant pool is expanding by the minute and you should be in front of them. And I think something I run into in my consulting calls, and I've kind of touched on this, but people are very focused right now on traveling nurses. And I think not that traveling nurses aren't good. I mean, we've certainly had quite a few traveling nurses as tenants, but just thinking about traveling nurses is really limiting your ability to be in front of all the different people that need a furnished rental.
That makes sense. So were you focusing on midterm rentals during the COVID period?
Yeah. So a lot of our clients are short-term renters. So we're kind of a hybrid between the two. And we came out of the short-term space, but we have pretty much been doing midterm rentals. We have pretty much been doing midterm rentals since 2017 because we just prefer it. And when COVID happened, that was interesting because you saw a lot of people that were married that did not want to spend COVID together. So we immediately started to get requests, more so than we expected, for people that wanted to get away from their spouse. So it's always been our focus, but we also kind of doubled down on it during that time.
So are you saying it actually performed better during COVID?
Yeah, for sure. There were people, I would say it has done better since, like during COVID and post COVID. I think during COVID, there were, people that didn't want to be near their spouses. There were also people that wanted to come to a city, but they needed to isolate before they saw their friends and family. You saw medical workers coming into the city. So you also, and this is a big demographic for remote workers, people that want to move to a new city, but they're not sure where they want to live. So they just hang out in the city for a couple months and then purchase a property. So all of that was very hot during COVID. And then post COVID, like I said, there's just different travel patterns with the tenants that align well with the midterm rental space.
Well, hopefully some of those spouses got their relationships worked out.
Maybe that told them something. I don't know.
I had one that was a couple of weeks ago, and I have a fourplex that we use as an Airbnb. And as I was going there, these people were carrying beds into their unit. They were getting ready to move into an apartment and they were staging their future furniture in my Airbnb. And I'm like, what are you doing? And they're like, oh, we're just going to put it in here for a minute. And they're like, we have a day bed. Is it okay if we put it over here on the side of the house? I'm like, well, actually I have a big shed that is perfect for that. So use that. And here's the code. It was cute because they were from Alaska and they were just a young couple they flew here with nothing, bought a vehicle, were buying furniture, and they had gotten an apartment within a couple of days. So it wasn't a big problem or anything, but it was neat seeing them move here and getting situated and everything.
It is kind of exciting to I was going to say, it's just exciting to see people when they're young and starting their lives and
full of energy and
totally.
all that.
Erin, I'm worried we're going to run out of time today because we got so much we want to cover.
Sure.
Since you have experience in both the short-term and the midterm rental space, do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe the differences you see and the challenges, or why you like midterm better? That's a big question, but what's the difference and why do you like that?
Yeah, I think it's a question I'm used to answering for consulting clients. I think in the short-term space, if you're going to self-manage, you're going to make the most money, but it's also the most work. And so it's in your house or it's in the same neighborhood, and you can self-manage and money is your top priority, then short terms are where you want to be. If it's out of state and you have to hire a property manager, a lot of the time the money is not that much better than a midterm rental, because property management for short-term rentals is expensive because it's a lot of work. So that's one way of thinking about short-term rentals. And then midterm rentals, if you are self-managing that short-term and self-managing your midterm, it's going to be slightly less money on the midterm rental, but dramatically less work. So on the midterm rental side, really the work involved is just getting set up on different platforms, vetting, and then getting a smart lock and a relationship with a cleaner and a handyman. And I feel like this is very easy to do out of state. And so you make more money. It's an elevated rent above long-term. And a lot of times they renew their lease, because midterm renters tend to act like short-term renters when they're shopping, but they act like midterm renters they act like long-term renters once they're installed. So that's kind of the difference. It's when I'm asking people about it, it's more like, what do you care more about? Do you care more about making the most money, or do you care more about being more passive? So I imagine for your clientele, passive might be more important. And so midterm or long-term is going to be a better option, or short-term with a property manager. But I really don't know why you would do that, because if you're going to get the same amount of money, you're adding more cooks to the kitchen with a property manager. So it'd be easier to just do the midterm rental, and certainly less work.
So since you're using those terms, let's talk about that. Do you consider what you're doing a passive or an active investing strategy?
Or
could it be both?
No, I consider it pretty passive. I think that there's an active portion of it, which is when you're doing the setup, right? Which is a day or two, or when you're doing your research. But that's going to be true across all rental strategies, because even if you're doing a short term or you have a property manager, you're probably self-educating on some level. You're self-educating on what the property needs to have, or you're self-educating on the property manager. So for any rental strategy, there's just going to be some upfront mentally taxing work that you have to do. But then after that, once you get your system set up, it's pretty passive, because you're getting these long rents, 3 to 6 months. And then, in plenty of time when someone's going to be gone, you just set the calendar, you vet. I guess I would consider a more active is like 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week. And midterm rentals are just not like that. It's going to be a couple hours every time the investment is available again. So whenever the rent is ending, you're going to have to, or whenever the tenancy is ending, you're going to have to find a new tenant. But with Airbnb and Zillow, it's just not that hard.
Okay. But so there's still a little bit of time involved. So it's not truly passive, but it's a lot less work than a short-term rental.
I would say it's about as passive as a long-term rental. If you consider a long-term rental passive, I would say you should consider a midterm rental passive. If you don't consider a long-term rental passive, then don't consider a midterm passive.
Well, we can debate this. I technically don't consider a long-term rental a passive investment, because there's still quite a bit of management that needs to be done, at least if you're going to try to get the returns you want. Even when you bring in a property management company, you're still technically not passive, because you have to manage the management company. So let's switch and talk about management companies, because you were saying, you sounded like you had some opinions about management companies, and I had written down, how do you manage your expectations with the management companies? But tell us more about your experience with property managers and how that relates to midterm rentals.
So I've never used a property manager. I've always done it on my own. But for my clients that have used property management, I usually find a lot of times when I'm talking to people and they've had a bad tenant experience, it has come from the property management sourcing that. Most people that are handling their own rentals actually don't run into that issue. It's more the property management that does it. I think the problem with property management, in my opinion, is that they start good, and then as they grow, they are just not equipped to grow. And so then their systems kind of break down. They don't have cleaners that are good. The communication isn't good. And they're also really squeezing dollars and cents. So you're not hearing from them. It becomes a volume game, and then they're not as good. And at the same time, they're taking a lot of money from you. So in the long term, it's 8 to 12% per month, and probably half or full for the first month's rent. And then in the midterm and short term, it's even more expensive. Short term, obviously, being the most expensive, and then midterm being somewhere in between. And I guess I feel like, in my opinion, you're better off to get that education, learn how to do it yourself, get comfortable with it, and then execute on it, you have more money, you're going to have better cash flow, your whatever equation that you're looking at, whatever your metric is that you care about in real estate is going to be better without the property management. So I really encourage people at least to try it without a property manager first. And then if they get frustrated, to bring in a property manager. But in the midterm and long-term space, I really think that property management, I question the value that they bring.
So, Erin, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying when we're talking about short-term and midterm rentals, it's not a cut and dry situation. It's very complex on how you set it up. It's almost like you need a consultant to help you figure it out. Would you say that's the case?
Yes, I like that line of thought a lot, line of thinking. I think that actually you're better off to spend a little time in the beginning knowing what to do, talking to an expert one-on-one, and then going off on your own. Because I really don't feel like, I feel like it's intimidating, but it's actually not that complicated once you start.
Well, and if you work with somebody who's got experience in it, they can help you get educated and do it properly. Now, I want to also talk about this. When I talk to people about short-term rentals, at least new people in the short-term space, they're like super excited because they're like, oh, I can make all this money, but they have no real understanding of how much work is involved. So I want to ask you, so that our listeners can get maybe a more realistic expectation. Have you had any challenges or frustrations with short-term or midterm rentals that we could tell our listeners about?
Yeah, I think I don't have really negative experiences. I feel like a lot of people are looking for like that worst case scenario, and I haven't run into that. I actually feel like tenants are much better behaved than people think. But I think your question is more about how hard is it? And it's actually much harder than people think. People, to your point, get very excited because there's a lot of money, but it's certainly not free money or easy money. There is a component of work. And I'm talking specifically with short-term rentals. It is why I left the short-term rental space, because even though the regulation changed in Denver, so in 2017, we couldn't do it anymore, but we certainly could do short-term, and some of the metros around it made it legal. Or in Colorado Springs, we have a property where we have the short-term license on it. We have just never elected to do it because it's just a lot of work. As I've said before, the short-term rental tenants tend to be quite demanding, and they have very high expectations. And so you're getting pinged a lot. They expect a high level of communication, and it feels much more like a job and much more like a service job. Whereas midterm rentals, you're not talking to them as much. And if you set up your systems well, you're really not talking to them hardly ever. And I happen to believe too, with my tenants, they actually don't want to be talking to me very much, just as I don't want to be checking in with them. So you just set up the relationship in the beginning, and then you're both kind of, I should note, I also give my tenants, my midterm and long-term tenants, the autonomy to set up their own maintenance and stuff, so that I'm not playing telephone trying to schedule for them. And I think that also really cuts down on the amount that we're communicating.
That's cool.
That's a good system you got in place there.
Do you have any consistent theories or seen a ratio in regards to what more you would make going from long-term to midterm? Like, is it a 1.25 ratio, or have you seen anything consistent?
Yeah, so when I'm working with people on the pricing, I go into Rentometer, look up the long-term rents, and then times it by 1.4, so a 40% markup. And then I go into Airbnb, VRBO, Furnish Finder, and see if that seems consistent with the other rentals, or modify it if there's like, if your place is much nicer, then you're going to have a little bit of an uptick. Or if it's not as nice, we might bring it down a little bit. And so that 1.4 is a starting place for me. And then I see how it aligns with other rentals. It tends to be pretty close, but I think that that's a good rule of thumb. And then also it depends on whether or not you're going to charge them for utilities, or if they're going to put the utilities in their name. So even though it's a midterm rental, technically, if it's furnished and they're going to rent for 6 months or more, I have them put the utilities in their name. But I usually don't drop the price, and I don't usually get asked about it. But there's different ways of running that. But 1.4 is a good multiplier for what you're going to make.
That's so perfect. I appreciate that. Can you speak to figuring out what the saturation level could or would be on midterms?
It's hard to find. So, I mean, you can go into Furnish Finder and Furnish Finder will have like a travel nurse demand. They call it that, but I think it's just the demand for that area. And obviously, more and more, there's starting to be people that are using Furnish Finder that aren't just travel nurses. So it's a little bit misnamed in that way. But I don't really count on that. I think what I advise my clients is you're not necessarily looking for proximity to a hospital or proximity for anything else. I think your best bet for a midterm rental, a short-term rental, a long-term rental is what the walk score is. It all comes down to location. And so if you have a really strong walk score, you can feel pretty confident that you're going to get renters. And I'm not overly worried about saturation. I'm more worried about how you set up on the platforms, which platforms you're on, and if you've taken professional photos and stuff, because you can have a lot of competition, but it doesn't mean your competition is good. And there's a way to stand out and you will get rentals at that point.
I love that.
Erin, can you give us your opinion about what will the short-term and midterm rental market look like in 5 to 10 years?
Yes. I mean, my thought on that is that they're both going to dominate. I don't think that this rental strategy is going away. I think with short term, it'll be interesting to see how cities handle it, right? Because it is causing housing affordability issues. And I think that that's a fair argument. I think if you look at certain neighborhoods or certain zip codes, it's impacting them much more than others. And so I think cities are compelled to put legislation on that to try and control it. And I think that that's fair. I read recently that there's only 3% of the United States actually has laws around this, but I think it's probably major metros that have adopted them. So even though not all the cities have it, a lot of the major cities have them. And I think we'll continue to see that as the US struggles with housing affordability. So I think that's what's going to happen in the short-term space is that you might see more legislation. And it also, honestly, kind of comes down to the politics. Cities that tend to be more conservative or locations that tend to be more conservative are actually more open to Airbnb because they believe it's your property, you do what you want with it. And then cities that are more liberal or towns, whatever, tend to be more restricting of it because they're looking at the housing affordability trends. So I think that's what you're paying attention to long term in the short term space. I think in the midterm space, we're only going to see growth on this because despite what some of the big people in tech like Elon and others are doing where they're trying to bring people back in, I just think it's unrealistic. I think the cat is out of the bag. And I think people are going to continue to lean into remote work and want remote work. And so because of that, I just think the midterm space is going to grow. I think the way you should think about this is if you agree with me and you think remote work is going to grow, then you should assume midterm is going to grow. If you disagree with me and you think that we're going to pull that back in, then you should think that midterm rentals might shrink a bit.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really interesting since the short-term and midterm rental markets are fairly new, that the way the government handles it, especially in your local area, is going to be important to watch when you're making purchase decisions on which investment property to be buying.
That is something that, I think it's where I think we had an easier path with real estate because we had a niche, where we could talk to people about it. And I think that that is one thing that I see a lot locally is people will have real estate agents sometimes that make them promises. And at the end of the day, it is the buyer's responsibility. It is their due diligence to know whether or not it's legal. But I see a lot of over-promising in listings or real estate agents saying, oh, you can do it. And it's like, no, you can't, or you can, but there's very limited restrictions around that. So I think that if you're looking for that type of property, it's really important to press the real estate agent on like, do you know this and where did you find that information? Because even people that work for the government, the local government, this is probably changing. But in the past, when I would call on the laws sometimes, they would tell me something and then it was obvious they didn't know what Airbnb was. So it was like, no, I need to see like, where are you finding that in the code? Because I need to know if that's actually right or not. And so for people listening, if you want to really double check yourself, you call the city planner and you ask them to show it to you in the code.
Well, and that could also be changing in the future, right? Like it's so new, we don't know how it's going to play out.
That's true, but most of the cities, because Denver and Denver Metro, well, so Denver hasn't changed, but some of the cities around Denver have changed, and Colorado Springs actually changed too. Most of the time, or I guess I haven't encountered a situation where this was different, they will grandfather you in. If you made an investment based on something the government put out or that was legal at the time, and then they changed the law, they allow you to continue to do it, which I think is fair because you made an investment based off of a legal option, and then it becomes illegal. And like in Denver, when they made the short-term rentals, it was never legal in Denver. It's just that it wasn't a problem. The code always said no fewer than 30 days, but no one paid attention. No one cared until Airbnb showed up.
Well, that's great news. Fingers crossed it stays that way and people get grandfathered in other cities as well.
Yeah.
Erin, will you define what house hacking is?
So the way I define house hacking is you are taking an existing asset and modifying it so that you're making income. That is a wordy way of saying you are taking on a roommate or a part-time roommate, but basically you're renting out a room or you're renting out your basement. You're using some part of your house or apartment that you are already paying a mortgage or rent on, and adding some, making it so someone else can stay in that place, either short-term or long-term. And that way your unused space is helping pay down the mortgage on your house.
That's awesome. I was watching my tenants walk up the stairs about 5 minutes ago. Hope they didn't make any noise. It's like, shh. What are some, I'll say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think basements are a very good option for this because I think basements often are unused space. They're dark. People don't necessarily want to be down there. So it's a good option for a rental, especially in the short-term space, because people can tolerate a little bit darker space if they're only coming in for 2 or 3 days. And so I love converting a basement into a rental area.
What are some of the benefits of house hacking?
I mean, the main benefit is that you are paying down someone else is paying down your mortgage, or you are minimizing your mortgage by having other people pay for it. And again, if you're doing something like a basement or a guest room that never gets used, I mean, you're already paying for that square footage, so you might as well make it work for you.
Absolutely. More high efficiency in the house. Would you say that this strategy is active or passive?
I think it's a little bit more active if they're in your house. I think if you have a basement unit that has a totally separate entrance, so a lot of times in houses in Colorado, at least, you will walk in a back door and the back door will go downstairs immediately to the basement, or you can turn to the right or the left and go into the kitchen. That's how a lot of ours are set up. So if you shut off the kitchen and put a door and they go into the basement, I would consider that passive because you're not necessarily seeing them. But serious house hackers tend to have someone in the bedroom next to them, or they're short-terming, and then you're running into those people in the kitchen, in the front yard. And for me, at least, I consider that passive. I'm not necessarily like in a point in my life where I want to see strangers in my kitchen. So other people are more social than me. They might be like into that, but it's not for me.
Not for a lot of people, for sure. On a show you were on, you mentioned, why should your first investment be a small condo? Is that for house hacking or short-term rentals?
Well, I would say it's more for mid-term rentals, because for a condo, you're going to probably run into an HOA issue. So even if you live in a city that allows for short-term rentals, there's a very good chance that your HOA won't. But so I would say it's more in the midterm or the long-term space. It could be for house hacking, but again, that has to be your comfort level of having a roommate, essentially. If you just want to do it as a straight investment, it's better for a midterm or long-term. And, I was making the point on that show that condos, we've had a lot of clients have a lot of success with condos. And again, if you think that you want to be more passive, your HOA can handle a lot of the property management that you otherwise would have to take care of or pay for. So I really like that. And I did an analysis once about like, what do you actually get out of a property management versus what would you get? Like, what is the cost analysis if you're paying an HOA versus paying for property management? And I think for us, at least, we were paying $70 more to be in an HOA, but we never talked to anyone, and our HOA was awesome and took care of everything. So I found that really to be well worth it. And I also just think first-time investors might not have the money for a single family home. And I think you see a lot of people talk themselves out of getting an investment. There's a lot of fear in the investment community about getting the perfect investment and not looking like an idiot and not losing money and like being the best of the best and like making the best decision. And so then they never buy. And I think a condo, you can be very well set up. It can pay your bills. You can have equity that you then pull out and do your next investment with. And that's what we did. So I just don't like it when people slam on condos or townhomes or anything with an HOA, because I definitely think you can still have success with that. And I think the worst thing to do is to never buy because you're just evaluating, but can't make a decision.
Roger, before you go on, I just want to throw in this disclaimer here. Erin, tell me if you disagree with this. For our listeners, condos can be a great investing strategy. A lot of condos have rental restrictions. So like with any other investment, make sure you look at all the details and understand what you can and cannot do with that property before you purchase it so that you don't get yourself into a bunch of trouble. Would you agree with that, Erin?
I do. And then the way to look at that too is to look at the use section in your HOA docs and just see a lot of them, some have a limitation for 6 months. Most of them have it for 30 days. I would go forward with a condo if it had a limitation of 60 days. I wouldn't do one for 90 days. I think 90 days is too restrictive if you're trying to do the midterm space. And then again, making sure that the condo you can rent in the space, but usually they're going to let you know that. And again, it's part of your due diligence where you're asking for these docs, and you can find that information before you're super far into the deal.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder to our listeners, on today's episode, we're talking about short-term rentals, house hacking, and we're going to get Erin's take on the Colorado market. So, Erin, since you're a real estate agent in the Denver area, can you tell us at least your opinion about what you see happening in the Denver market over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think we're seeing so Denver has gotten quite expensive, and that's a big concern for people, is that it's so expensive. Is it at the top of the market? I don't happen to personally believe that, because we're not as expensive as Seattle. We're not as expensive as some of the coastal cities, and we still just are a very strong place to invest in. And the reason for that is because there's no one sector that if they left, it would cripple the market. We have a very educated employment base here, so there's already a lot of money. We have great weather, we have healthcare, we have marijuana, we're about to have mushrooms, we have the travel industry, and people, with the mushrooms and the marijuana, I mean, the marijuana obviously really took off, but the mushrooms also, it's a medical situation. It will be both recreational. I'm not going to pretend it's not, but there are also uses for medical, which I think you're going to see also grow quite a bit. And I think it may copy what happened with marijuana. So I think Denver, although expensive, still has potential to become more expensive. We're also the only major city in a big radius, right? Like Kansas City is a little bit off to the side, and Las Vegas, but Las Vegas is very different than Denver, and Kansas City is not anywhere close to Denver. And our weather is amazing. So I think in Denver, you're going to continue to see it be expensive. I think if you're thinking about investment strategies and appreciation, Denver is good, but you also might be smart to look at some of the metro areas around Denver, because they also rent well and they do well. And so they tend to be a little bit cheaper. So Colorado Springs is actually a good place to be. You see a lot of Denver restaurants moving to Colorado Springs because the rent has gotten so expensive in Denver that they're moving down. And you think, well, if more of that happens, then Colorado Springs also is going to grow and become more expensive. So just paying attention. I think Denver is still a good investment, but I think some of the metros around Denver might be a better investment.
That makes a lot of sense. And you might not be willing to answer this next question because it's probably your secret sauce, but are you willing to share what markets you like to look at for short and midterm rentals?
Well, I'll say this. For midterm rentals, my consulting clients are always like, how do I know which market's better than the other, blah, blah, blah. And I will say, I don't actually care about that. I care about the walk score. If you have a good walk score, you are probably in a pretty solid area regardless. And I think if you're in the middle of nowhere, what you're looking for is to be the only property that offers that. So I just had a tenant that was a consulting tenant in Missouri. And she was like in a small town in Missouri, but she was the only midterm rental. And she's already acquired 4 rentals in a year because she's like, I just can't I can't keep up. There's no competition. So I think you either want to be the outlier or you want to be in a place with a really high walk score. And that will do well in the midterm and short-term space. People aren't abandoning cities. I mean, I think that there was a little bit of that during COVID, but people still like to be around people and they still like to have options as far as restaurants. And that's also honestly where your higher paying tenants are going to flock to as well.
Since you're referencing it, can you tell us where people should look for a walk score?
Yeah, actually, I did. There's a video on this on my YouTube, but on Zillow, if you just go into the main Zillow screen, you click into a house. Yes. So if you go into Zillow and you click into a house or a property, there's a nav bar off to the right side. You scroll to the right and you'll see a neighborhood tab. You click on the neighborhood tab and it'll pull up the walk score.
Awesome.
And Redfin has it as well, but it's a little bit more buried.
Okay. Great advice.
On a walk score, that's a 1 to 100 score, correct?
Yeah, and they only report it if you're 50 or higher, and it's based on your capacity to have a life walking somewhere, right? So that you have to be able to do certain things all on foot, and that's what it's based off of.
What number would you say is actually a good walk score?
I tell people to shoot for 80 or above, but I can tell you, like, my personal residence is a 65, which kind of surprised me because I actually find it decently walkable. So I think if you can find 80 or above, great. If not, 70 or above is good. But if you want a really premium property, shoot for 80 or above.
Thank
Erin,
you for that.
On a different show, you talked about 5 common real estate investor mistakes. Can you share briefly 1 or 2 of those so listeners can know what to be avoiding and not making the mistakes that you talked about?
Yes. I think some of my clients laugh about this or if they've read the book, but I'm really anti-yard at this point. It is my biggest pet peeve with my investments because water usage, at least where I'm at in Colorado, is only getting more and more expensive. And a yard is actually quite important that it looks good because it's the first impression of the property. So if they walk up and there's weeds, they have an immediate negative association that you're then trying to overcome. So it's really important that
unless it's the other weed, right?
It's the fun weed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that if they come up and they see weeds, that's not good. And you have mixed interest there because the existing tenant does not care about watering that yard and the new tenant does care about the yard, right? So I think the best advice is to rock in the yard or look for a very small yard. I think turf options are becoming better and better, but yards are just expensive and they are a pain. So I always tell people, do not go for a place with a yard. Another investor mistake that I think people have a negative opinion of letting animals in, but when you actually look at the analysis, it looks like the insurance claim for landlords that allow for animals is about $37 annually, more than people that don't allow for animals. And you can charge a lot more than $37 to allow someone to bring an animal. For people in the midterm space too, when you think about your tenant pool, who has flexibility to move around? It's usually people that are late 20s to their late 30s. They're making some money. They don't have a kid. They have their first kid, which is the fur baby. And so if you allow them to bring in animals, I think it really opens up your pool. That said, you need to check with your insurance if there are certain breeds that your insurance will not protect you on. German Shepherds tend to be a big one. And so just making sure that you limit to the breeds that your insurance will cover. And or I only let dogs that are 40 pounds or less. So dogs currently have no rights. It looks like in Colorado they might get some rights, but right now they don't have any rights. So you can really restrict what animals you let in.
On a side note, I have a guest coming to my basement on the 1st, they'll stay 5 nights. The pet fee alone for this 5 nights is $250.
Yep. There's a premium.
Pretty good money.
For your dogs.
Hopefully they're really good dogs.
Right. And the other thing too is that it's like you actually or maybe saving them some money too, because if they can't bring the dog, they have to pay for kennel costs. So, because I mean, we have 2 dogs, right? And we want the dogs with us, and we're going to have to pay for them to go somewhere. So we're happy to pay that fee because we get to have the animals, and we would that cost would go somewhere else either way.
Erin, I want to be respectful of your time. We have a couple more questions we ask at the end. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in regards to anything we've discussed today?
No, I mean, I guess my advice to investors in general is don't overthink it. Real estate is really not that complicated. You are not looking for the perfect investment. You are looking for a good investment, and that's where you want to start.
Thank you for that.
Very cool. Side note before we go to the end, how many women are in your women's investing club? And is that a Facebook group?
So I kind of moved it to Substack, and then I also have a website. So it's a little bit in transition right now. I think the mailing list is like 500 people. And then for the last few online sessions, like 15 have shown up. And I was doing it before and then stopped doing it for like a year and just brought it back. So I actually expect that number to go up. And we don't necessarily advertise for it. We just have SEO around it and talk about it. And then that's how people find it.
All right, Erin, we're going to start the final 4. We have 4 questions that we ask everybody so we can get a broad overview from where they come from. The first one, what is your favorite business book?
The Art of Gathering, which doesn't seem like a business book, but it's all about how, if you're going to do meetups or you're going to try and bring people in for community, there's a right way to do it versus a wrong way to do it. I think it's very well written. It's very interesting. And if you're going to get in front of people, you need to do it strategically and not just bring them in and say, we're here and now we're going to talk about real estate. You need to give them some direction. It will be much more effective.
Very cool. I like that. And I'm definitely going to have to make Ben read it.
It is a great book.
I've bought several books already that are recommendations from our podcast interviewees. So I'm a little behind on my reading. Erin, what brings you happiness?
Can I say Vanderpump Rules? Don't put that. I don't know. You can put that. I mean, in general, I'm a big reader. I like to spend time with my dogs and my husband. I like to write as a hobby. So that's kind of how I like to spend my time. And I assume, yes, that makes me happy. Also, I'm an organization freak. I'm looking at my car and I just got it washed. That makes me very happy. It looked disgusting. Now it looks good.
Just so you know, the books behind you aren't even. There's a little taller one back there. I'm just kidding.
There won't be after if we get off this call.
All right. Question number 3. Describe what your future retirement looks like.
Mexico. I think one reason why we were interested in acquiring this property in Mexico is that we think it's a good investment, but also the way it works in Mexico is that you pay, at least the way it worked for us, is we had to pay 50% up front and then pay the whole thing off before it's delivered. So I think we're very interested in eventually moving to Mexico. And then, it's about 60% cheaper, like their grocery stores and stuff are 60% cheaper. So I think for us, it's interesting to move down there and have a cheaper lifestyle quite a ways out, not anytime soon, but they also have decent healthcare. So I think we're interested in being down there.
That's awesome. What do you think is the best way to give back?
Education. I think that as I've marched through real estate, I think initially it was scary to me when I first got into real estate and we were working with our friends or clients that were very educated, white. They had I don't mean that I just mean they had all the opportunities set up for them, everything that, they had the easiest track of anyone, and they were still really struggling to acquire properties. And that frightened me a little bit. And I don't mean just investments. I mean, their primary residence as well. And so that made me concerned for everybody that didn't have everything go perfectly for them. And so I think just putting a real emphasis, I think it's important to myself. and to my husband to open up opportunities and have free opportunities where you're giving people advice that really is meaningful and that they can act on. And also identifying that just because you don't look like the people in the space doesn't mean that you shouldn't be in that space. So I think that is what we really care about in our emphasis. And I think, that's what we are both trying to do, and trying to figure out better ways to do it without being clumsy about it, because it's sort of a sensitive situation, but just opening up more education or providing the information we have to people and getting them across the line a little bit.
That's cool. Where can our listeners find you online?
So on YouTube, I have a pretty expansive, I have a lot of videos on YouTube, I will say, and I try to make them pretty educational. So on YouTube, the handle is just Erin and James Real Estate, and it's Erin, ERIN, like the female spelling and not the male spelling, which AI is so sexist. Everything I do, it's like AARON all the time. That's a good place to find us. And then our website is Erin and James Real Estate. Or if you're interested in Denver Women Invest, it's denverwomeninvest.com, or on Substack, you can find it. We also have the weekly podcast that's on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you would listen to a podcast, and it's Colorado Real Estate. And you can find us, and we're there every week. I think it's Colorado specific, but then some of the topics definitely apply to the larger federal picture.
We're going to have all those links in our show notes as well for our listeners. A quick summary of what we covered on today's episode. Erin shared quite a bit of knowledge with us about short-term and midterm rentals and how you can try to implement that strategy for yourself. And if you have any questions, she offers consulting on how to do it. We also talked about house hacking and what that looks like and how the benefits that could add to your investing strategy. And we talked a little bit about Erin's take on the Colorado markets, and also things that you can do to mistakes you should avoid so that you can have a great time doing investing.
Thank you so much, Erin, for joining us on the Retire Wealthy and Happy podcast. We'll see you all next time.
Bye, guys. I hope everybody retires happy and wealthy.
Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Erin.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Hope you got value from this episode. And if you have a minute, then take the time to leave an honest written review for the podcast, because we take those reviews seriously, and it'll help us serve you better on the next episodes. And most importantly, be sure to start taking action so you can control your financial future today.